There is power in knowledge, but the true power is in applied knowledge. Dunning-Kruger effect shows that with a little bit of knowledge, you get lots of self-confidence. So in other words, you have people who don't know much, but they have learned a great deal. They don't know what they don't know, but they know that they have learned a lot. You can't change everybody, but you can change self. Acknowledge that beliefs you have could be challenged, and that's a healthy thing. Don't trust everything that you believe. In other words, have enough self-doubt to know that your beliefs may be just convenient truths that you subscribe to, and they may not be truths at all.
If you don't evolve, you die. Those people who didn't bother learning about Google or search engines or computers, they eventually got obsolete in the workforce.
One of the main skills is asking the right questions in the right way.
Welcome to another episode of the Wealth Elevator. Today we're diving into macroeconomics that we see as investors. Today I have a special guest, business coach that I've been working with for a couple years now as part of a group called Vistage with other CEOs. Tomasevic has been a seasoned business advisor. As we all know, there's different types of generations in the workforce today. I found it very interesting how the baby boomers, the millennials like myself, the Gen X, and then the Gen Z. And I think for investors too, some good frameworks to see where demographics are going. A lot of us will invest in things like multifamily or office. So obviously a lot of impact on where the puck is going. Tomas has a great deep understanding in the predictive index too, which him and I talk a lot about when working with our employees. We're going to be diving into this one specific topic today of generations, which is why I decided to bring him on. Thanks for jumping on, Thomas. Why don't you give us a little introduction of where you came from, your previous life before you stepped in as a Vistage chair?
Sure. So I came to the States in 1989 and got my undergraduate and graduate here. And as I started my career here, one of the things that I really enjoyed was that I could use my psychological insight into my business applications. And so that allowed me to work for companies like Compaq, HP, Microsoft, and other large companies and be a successful high-level executive, as well as have some startups. So I started a startup in 2000 and essentially did that, worked for Frog Design, I was entitled to start a startup within a company. It was a mix of large and small businesses that I thoroughly enjoyed. One of the most character forming was during my MBA days, one of the teachers forced us to learn about psychometrics. And psychometrics was basically understanding the psychology at the workplace, understanding how the personality impacts thinking, decision making, making mistakes, making progress, all of the above, right? How we mesh as separate, different individuals. That was a part of success that I can probably attribute to knowing this as a young MBA without too much business experience. I think as the time went by, it was important to understand the economy. And that is, Elaine, what we typically do when we take a look at ITR economic reports, where we take a look at what is the economy doing. That's a one step up from your business. So your business is a microeconomics type of thing that you can influence, you can strategize it, you can align it with what you want to do and what is available. And that is at your control. So that's your microcosmos. This is where psychometrics really play a strong role because you want to create a very good team that collaborates well. The high level is the economy. You can't make progress in a bad economy if you depend on it. And sometimes you're counter-cyclical. So you can make lots of progress in a bad economy because you're driven by the opportunities that exist only when the economy is down. And then the high level up that guides the economies is this generational, this demographic stuff. Because even with the economy being strong or weak, you cannot deny that it all depends on the workforce. It all depends on the consumers. It all depends on the people who are generating income as well as people who are spending an income. And this story today about generation is going to be about the balance between the money makers and the money spenders and how that is affected by different generations.
Before I hand the wheel completely over to Thomas to go through this great presentation here, I will say that you've been greatly impactful to me on my business over the last couple of years. We went down pretty big correction in commercial real estate. As much as Thomas is going to sound like a college professor, as you guys know, we don't bring on college professors on this show because they just don't know what they're talking about. It's just going to seem academic, but I've searched the world for different coaches for myself. And you always find that 20, 25-year-old life coach who's never started a business and never even worked a career in his life. It's really hard to find a coach that has as much life experience, more importantly, business experience. It's as much as we're going to be going into the generational talk here, just know that it's just one part of the puzzle that Thomas gets into. I think we'll talk about PI a little bit.
Awesome. Thank you for the trust. And yes, I hope to make it not so academic. Frankly, I think that there is power in knowledge, but the true power is in applied knowledge. If this is just for the sake of knowing it, it's not very useful. So let's take a look at the fundamentals of the generations here. The first thing that we're going to look at is what are generations. You know that there is generation X, baby boomers. You know that there is generation Y or millennials. You know that the upcoming generation Z and alphas. But what does that mean? What defines a group of people? The academic description is it's a bump in the population that has a beginning and an end. It goes from a certain date to a certain date that is statistically relevant. In other words, if you take a look at Generation X or millennials, you will see that there was a dip before they started and dip once they're ended. Statisticians and demographic experts use those dates to define a generation. A better experiential explanation is that these are the people that share common life-forming experiences. When we talk about baby boomers, we generalize because they have certain experiences, certain events that they have experienced during their lifetime, and the same is true for Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z, and in other words, they share a common knowledge. Without knowing, they agree on certain things, and do not have the knowledge of what may have happened before them, and they don't have the things that are going to happen after them. So they share certain beliefs. With that knowledge of sharing beliefs, it is relevant that we understand what those beliefs are, acknowledging that they are there. It is important for us to understand not only who are the generations, but what they believe and why.
For those of you listening on the podcast format, we also have full slides on the podcast YouTube section, just separate from the YouTube section, which you guys can take a look at if you're more visual learners there. But I guess so here's my question. You see that Gen X is a little bit more squeezed to what about 12 years, and the millennials is almost 2 decades. I'm actually in the millennials section. I'm a very old millennial, which gives me goosebumps a bit. Why is that? How do they define the bookends here?
It's usually they're defined in retrospect. If I was to tell you this is what's going to define the next generation, that would probably be a guess. When we look back at what defines the generations, let's see how that is done. There was the greater generation, there was the silent generation. Those generations are mostly have left us. There is not that many survivors that were born in the beginning of the 20th century, 1900s. So we're talking about baby boomers as now being the oldest. They were born between 1945, 1946, give or take, in 1965. So why do we see that? They were the post-Second World War babies. In other words, many people died in the Second World War. That was a global event, millions upon millions. After the Second World War, there was lots of need for workforce. There was lots of hope. There was lots of positivity. And that resulted in this big boom of babies. And that's what we call a baby boom, baby boomers, right? So it was a post-war, this optimism-driven euphoria in families in America, in Europe, and anywhere else that the Second World War affected people strongly. So there was a big statistical bump in people growing and people like being born between these two dates. Typically, generation is about 20 years. That's like a common thing, but you can see that in roughly these dates here, 57, 54, this is really the age of the people relative to a few years ago. So in other words, if you look at this end of the yellow era, there was a small decline. The decline started happening in the 60s, where the cultural shift was starting to occur, and that is people were more against the wars and for freedom of speech and whatnot. And that was a cultural shift, which is attributed to the beginning of the Generation X and the end of the baby boomer generation in the number of babies born that defined the end of one generation, the beginning of the other. Plus, at that point, baby boomer generation was already over 20 years old. So in other words, the first baby boomers born after the Second World War in 1945, 46 were already in their 20s. And that's typically how statistically we try to keep it grouped. So baby boomers from this to about 65. What is unique about them? It's unique that they were the generation that got into their teenage years at the event of the PC. The big change for them was that they were the generation that went from basically a telephone communication to a beginning of the cell phone, beginning of the PC being in every desktop world, and the beginning of the internet. That's the generation that grew up without these things, but created these things. A Generation X Baby boomers were viewed as a little bit technology resistant. When you think about older people that don't really use the internet and the cell phones, you would know that they are usually older people. That's the generation of baby boomers. Generation X is fully capable of using computers. They were the ones who caused the cell phone and computer era to really begin and flourish. So they are the creators of that. So that's why we say from 1966, they were about 20 in 1986. And that is roughly where the next generation started. And that's the next generation millennials that were born into formative years where the computers were everywhere. Internet was starting to be everywhere. Cell phones were ubiquitous. And though maybe they did not grow at the age of 4 to have a touchscreen in their hands, but they grew into the teenage years where they could expect to have a cell phone of their own. And that changed the communication. It changed the communication from scheduling it to having it randomly at any given time. So now, to you, that seems, yeah, so what? That's how it always was. That's not how it was in the generations before. The communication became ubiquitous, at least the verbal communication and texting. That was something that millennials grew up into. I had my first phone in 96, cell phone in 96. It was a fully digital phone, 3G and all of that good stuff. It seems like a dinosaur now, but at that point, a 10-year-old millennial would see as an upcoming technology. So they would greet it, they would welcome it, and they would grow later on into expecting that cell phone is something that everybody has. But keep in mind, 84 to 2004, so they were in their 20s when the iPhone was created. Not for all millennials, but for the oldest millennials, they were in their 20s when the touchscreen interface became a thing. They have a little bit of a memory of phones being semi-analog, cellular being there, PCs being big boxes that everybody uses. They're this hybrid between a desktop and a tablet world where they can use both. They can integrate themselves with Generation X, and they're also forward looking into what is currently the only thing available, which is pretty much touchscreens everywhere. So they're discovery generation. They're the first generation that grew up with internet present, and that significantly changed how they think of knowledge. So keep this in mind. Before internet became available to our fingertips, you had to learn and retain that knowledge. All of the generation up to the end of the Generation X were taught to retain information. Information was what distinguished one person from another. Knowing stuff was something that Generation X took pride in. Millennials came about and they learned that everything they need to know is Google search away. And that changed the perception that knowledge needs to be retained to the perception that knowledge needs to be shared. Why? Because it's readily available. And that created a little bit of generational rub between baby boomers, Generation X, and millennials.
I'll say that was my experience. Again, I'm a very older millennial, but when I came in, the baby boomers and Gen X, you see this a lot, especially in the blue collar world. The older guys, the guys with seniority, held on to the SOPs, the procedures as job security. They don't want to tell us. When That's why I fill my mind with this type of stuff. It helps me understand why the old guy was worried that we'd steal his job. Maybe he was if he was a low performer, but it was more like that. We have the assumption that information is readily out there. It should be free and accessible or open source for everybody.
Yeah. No, and I think that is a shift. My generation before me believed that knowledge is power. And it's not that you would not share it. It's just that giving you the conclusion that took me 10 years to create would be underserving you. It would be robbing you of the experience of getting there. And it seems that was a little bit lost in translation. The second thing is skill. You can see that we have a huge decline in skilled labor. Why? Because you can't Google that, right? You cannot acquire expertise of being a skilled welder, a skilled technician by Googling how to do it. Part of it is skills are transferred to experience. And so that is a little bit of a problem with the internet generation. You can see how it's done, but you would not become an expert by looking it on YouTube. You have to do it yourself, especially with the following Generation Z and Alpha. We have a huge decline in ability to even perform basic motor functions that have to do with manual labor. And that is creating a huge need for people like that and a very low availability of such people. So what we are seeing is that baby boomers and Generation X technicians are now in extremely high demand because they know how to do technical stuff that frankly is not a subject to easy transfer of knowledge. It is a kind of thing that you acquire over years. It is experience, it is skill, it is finesse that you would not be able to transfer to someone who is not willing to spend years learning it. And so that is a little bit of an open question as to where are we going to end up in the future.
As far as macroeconomics goes, there is a couple ways you can look at this. The blue collar work is going to be going up in demand. That's why truck drivers get paid so much. Nobody wants to do the grunt work, and everybody wants to go to college these days. I got into an argument with an older person, Tomas, a long time ago, that I think a lot of the baby boomers and the older Gen X folks have this ideal that they grinded years in the workforce to learn certain things. And they have this belief that you need to develop that or grind through it. And they said they need to see somebody in the seat for 10 years, 20 years before they get that type of director role. And I don't argue with that, but as you and I work employees, that's just not what Gen Alpha, Gen Z want. And the way I see it is if you're a millennial or Gen X, you're in the middle trying to deal with all this nonsense to both ends.
So basically what you're describing is a Dunning-Kruger effect. Dunning-Kruger effect shows that with a little bit of knowledge, you get lots of self-confidence. So in other words, you have people who don't know much, but they have learned a great deal. And with that learning, they haven't learned much. They don't know what they don't know, but they know that they have learned a lot. You have these younger people that will learn very quickly and their self-confidence will skyrocket. That is where you have younger people who want to be on top of the world. They want to be CEOs. They want to be CFOs. They have a high degree of self-confidence. They are capable of doing their job. But much of it, per Dunning-Kruger, is that they simply don't know what they don't know. And because they don't know how much they don't know, they believe that everything they know is what they know. Essentially, what we have is this case where in the early learnings, your self-confidence go through the roof. And you believe that you are, how can I say,
It's like my out of shape friend who thinks that when they go and work out for the first couple of weeks and they're just making great gains and they think it's so easy, right?
correct. We're just basically scratching the surface here. Some people may not like this because it may put them in a slightly insecure position. This is what we are seeing, and we're seeing this with any generation. It is not new. It just the new generation have a momentum of being able to share so much more information with each other. They confirm their beliefs very easily. Why? Because we have social media. So this is something that previous generations did not have. If I have a strong belief that I'm self-confident, I have to prove it to everybody, including my own peers. I did not have a way to share with all my peers and say, this is my insight. Probably people of your generation had to grind it to extent as well, because that was pre-Facebook, pre-Instagram, pre-TikTok. Your belief system did not have a chance to be confirmed by others easily. So you have to prove it. Now, the younger generation do not have to prove it. They share the beliefs and the belief spread. There's no evidence required. As long as they believe it, it's true. Essentially, you get out of school and you don't know much. This is the competence curve, and this is the confidence curve, or line, should I say. As your competence grows, your confidence skyrockets very quickly. Why is that? Because all of a sudden you know much and you're useful, confident, you believe you can do a lot. This is what we see that in the 20s, the first few years of growth brings people to the belief that the world is really easy, that the other people must be extremely stupid because they don't know that life is so easy. And it seems to people in this early stage that they can conquer the world. And that is true for any younger person of any generation ever. It's just that the current generation can share that, and they will probably find that other people who are going through the same age development will agree. So you end up basically having small competency increase. This is not much. This is the first 2, 3, 4 years of experience in the work industry, in the workplace. You get your confidence going from, oh my God, I don't know anything, I'm going to get fired right away, to, wow, I know everything. And your confidence is immensely high. And you believe that you can do everything. Now, without trying to offend anybody, this point here is called the top of the mount stupid. And essentially what it means is that you have got to the level of your inexperience. In other words, you are basically now going to face the things that you did not even know are there. And as soon as you face problems, somebody gives you something that you cannot Google and find out because frankly, you do not have the experience to do it, your confidence will start to decrease. So what happens is you continue to increase in competence over time. You learn more and you believe, of course, I know everything. And then sometimes later, you're like, oh my God, there is more to it than I thought. And your self-confidence plummets. And it continues to plummet. And it say, oh my God, this is so complicated in your 6 years of experience that your confidence is so low that you see, I'll never understand this. To give you an example, many of the generations Z and Alphas have grown into a weird world. Generation Z has gone through a very booming 2014 to 2024 when things got really hard with COVID. The government stepped in and took care of things. And those are all the formative years they have. They have seen prosperous 2010s and they can see COVID. Based on those two things, they can see that world is either great and you can make lots of money or the government steps in and takes care of it. Consequently, if you were to force them to face a decline in industry, decline in economy, such as a recession, they will not know what is happening there. They will expect that somebody is going to step in and take care of it. And that's not what happens. In other words, you have this economic cycles that happen that are not known if you didn't live long enough. What this tells us is that when you get to a certain level of competence where you see that there is a lot more you need to know, but you start giving yourself the credit for the things that you already know, this will be maybe this point. Okay, it's finally starting to make some sense to me. You're at the point close to the high level of competence. And you're saying, okay, but my confidence is not high because I don't know everything to the right of this point. I have no idea what are the things I haven't seen before. At some point, after years of turmoil, you will get to the point and say, hey, was it easy? No. Was it complicated? Yes. But my confidence is rising because I have shown to myself and to the world that I can go through 20 years worth of experience, 20 worth of ups and downs and survive. That is not something that a person in this early stage can say. They can say, I have seen 2 years of life. If I'm this successful in my 2 years of life, just imagine how successful I'm going to be in my next 30 years, which means that people who are struggling and are older than me must be inferior in some way. And so basically that shakes things up. This is an experience that unfortunately everybody will go through, unless you're extremely protected child by some coincidence that you don't have to be facing the world outside. Chances are that this is something that everybody will have to go through because you're going through the world that has ups and downs. So basically, just so that people know when they are and the people listening can relate, the silent generation has been the generation of people that built the country after the Second World War. They were the fathers and mothers of baby boomers. Baby boomers were from 1946 to 1965. Generation X was from 1965 born all the way to about 1984. Millennials are roughly from 80 or 84 to about 95. Generation Z is from 95 to about 2010. And then Generation Alpha has been since 2010. So they're teenagers at this point or young. So these are the generations. So we're going to take a look at quickly at what makes this generation unique and their beliefs. The slide shows a few people from the greater generation. That is the generation born before 1928. We have some number, small percentage and shrinking of the survivors from the generation that is the silent generation. And why do we call this generation that was born between 1928 and 1945 silent? Because they were heads down, they're building the world. If you were born in 1945, you were dealing with a torn down Second World War leftovers. If you were born in 1928, you were already 20 when that happens. So what did you have to do? You had to basically just grind it and get things fixed. So these were not the generation that was fighting social inadequacies. They were not fighting for discrimination. They were fighting for survival. And they were heads down. They were not known for political enlightenment in a sense, because they were dealing with survival. And if you take a look at the Maslow hierarchy of need, they were operating at a very low level of the need. They were worrying about having the shelter, having the food, surviving this, and protecting their family. Why is that? The world was ruined by the Second World War. United States was lucky not to be suffering too much from it. However, we did have losses of people that went to Europe and never returned. We did have huge expenses that had to be recouped. We had industry that was transformed from productive to military use. All of that stuff needed to be rebuilt back into the 1950s, and the silent generation were the active people of working age that did that. The baby boomers were the result of the need for more people. And that's why we have so many baby boomers. That was the biggest generation ever from 1946 to 1964. So they grew up into this euphoria of Second World War post period, where the government was pumping money. There was lots of opportunities. There was lots of everybody who wanted to work, could work. Relatively speaking, some baby boomers would say that succeeding in life was easier during those times. If you wanted to work hard, you had ample opportunities to prove yourself. And if you were the best, you did not have much competition. That is an interesting insight from that generation about themselves. Go ahead.
And also from an investing, personal finance and investing perspective, this is where your dad tells you, oh, just put your money in the 401k. It did 8 to 12% for me every year. But
The financial industry really started forming itself the way that you understand it in the 1970s. I don't know how much baby boomers in their early age did they benefit from the Wall Street was there. Investment of that sort existed. In those days, I think in the post-World War era in the US in particular, people had good jobs and good pensions. This was the time when you could work for IBM for 30 years and retire from IBM, right? This was a stable years of growth, right? You don't know very many companies that went out to business before 1965 or 68 or 69. It was basically the years full of turmoil and political uncertainty and ups and downs really after this generation. That was in the formative years of Generation X. The next Generation X, born in the mid-60s all the way to 1980s, they lived through the unrest that had to do with companies going up and down. There was a big fuel crisis in the 1970s. We saw the world of stable American industry being challenged by the Japanese. We saw this conspicuous consumption being challenged by the financial downturns. Many of the formative years of Generation X were iffy, right? There was no stability. In Europe, that was the days of terrorism, where in most of the Western countries, you had bombing every week, one way or another. You had the PLA, you had unrest in the UK. It was a very tumultuous time to be growing up where you couldn't say that the world is great. You could say world is uncertain. And so that results in certain beliefs that set in for the whole generation. Both baby boomers, Generation X, are savers. They tend to believe that saving money is relevant, especially if you're coming from areas impacted by the horrors of the Second World War. They believe that the world is not always going to be a great place. In certain parts of the world, there is a belief that you can save all you want, but somebody will come and take it away during your life. And they believe that with certainty. And that has to do with the generational experiences, right? US is lucky to have stability, but you will see that based on when you grew up, seeing your parents employed or unemployed at times, based on seeing that the wealth of your family grew or disappeared, you will have certain beliefs of how the world operates. And Generation X, perhaps less so than the baby boomers, had an experience that the world is much more uncertain. There were ups and downs in the 70s and particularly in the 80s. In the 80s, we had an inflation that was 18%. It was basically, that was the time when dollar was untied from the gold reserves. And that really changed the economic world. They tried to make sense of it. You don't necessarily always make sense of what's going on, especially when you're young, but you get used to the feeling of uncertainty. That was Generation X. They were open to technology and are responsible for the boom of PCs, Apples, and cell phones. They were from 1965 to 1980, give or take. 1980 to 1996, that's the millennial generation. If you take a look at the world in which they were born into, it was the world of belief that technology is everything. If you were to compare that to the generation baby boomers, they would not share the belief because that was not true in their time. When they felt what was important, it was not the technology. There was lots of hard work results in high results. There was lots of industrial work. There was also economic work. There was also learning and whatnot. The opportunities during the 1950s, 60s, and 70s were much different than they were in the 80s and 90s. In the 90s, we got into this blind spot of believing that technology solves all. That resulted in the big dot-com era boom in the late 90s and 2000s, where many of the companies we know today, like Google and a few others, were launched into the world of technology because that's where the solutions were. investments were huge. Generation Y or millennials got to benefit from all that investment in technology. This is a relatively new phenomenon for the human race, that we have technology that is changing us. Millennials probably never had a chance to experience the world any other way because that's how the world was when they were growing up. But this means that the change is huge, the change is common. You have lots of technological upbringing. You believe that what you have today will be obsoleted in a number of years. You're always learning and adjusting and you're relying on it. That's the difference between millennials and Generation Z. Millennials use technology but do not depend on technology as much. Generation Z would not rely on technology so much that they would not have a personal identity without technology. If you were to take away digital, what is remaining? For Generation Z, not much. All of their knowledge, all of their beliefs, all of their references are digital. They have not learned that the world depends on what they do, how they do it, and what they know. Millennials are somewhere in between. Millennials are integrating themselves with the business world quite well. Your generation, your age group, and older are well integrated into the worldwide because they have families, they have responsibilities. They know that the differentiation they have between people depends on what they do and what they know.
We had a conversation about this at one of our sessions about what you just said about the Gen Z seems a little cold hearted. But when you look at how YouTube Shorts and TikTok is, you had a big switch away from people search for certain things as opposed to the platform serves it up based on the algorithm. I'll just say it. If you're somebody who's more on the political right spectrum, and you Google a few things or put into YouTube, it's going to serve you up those things that confirm your
Oh,
bias.
that's right.
Same
And
thing
that
on
is
the other end.
an interesting side effect of all of this digitalization and social media is that we are actually growing apart. Your belief system is very easy to be justified as the only belief system needed because there's so many resources and people who are talking about the positive aspect of it. You never even get to be exposed to the opposing opinion. Opposing opinion, whatever that may be to you or anybody else, never gets to be seen. And they also live in the same bubble of reinforcing their own beliefs to the point that there is a huge gap in beliefs of who is right and who is wrong, and there's nothing in between these extremisms, right? So you talk about conservatives and liberals, pro-socialist and pro-capitalist groups, pro-government, anti-government, any other extremes, probably all the way to cats versus dogs, right? You can build a system that completely negates the validity of anybody outside of your system. And that's very unhealthy, but it's very unhealthy. It is not a designed, expected term of digitalization and social integration of the digital era. It is a side effect which shows us how misused a good concept can be. It is rather sad, but oftentimes you have a hard time bridging those things. Why? Because there is so much belief built up behind some of the worlds in which you exist. You don't even see the need to exit it or question yourself. At least my mantra is if you're talking about a conflict with someone and you're talking about a different belief that you hold compared to what they do, I don't believe that you have the right to hold yourself right until you can argue their point of view. In other words, the least amount of justice we need to do to the people we are working with is try to understand how they see the world. And only when you can actively take ownership of what they're saying and agree that they have a point, because most of them are not dumb. Most of them are just as smart as you are. They just have different belief. If you want to argue something from a perspective of not understanding what the other side is talking about, that is always going to result in conflict. So at Vistage, we try to understand it. Why? Because we have employees that may have very different beliefs than we are, and we need to manage them. We need to create 2 plus 2 equals 5. We need to create value that results from understanding and being able to metaphorically finish other sentences so that we do not have to have a conflict in everything that we do. If we do, that's 2 plus 2 equals 3, and that is hard to succeed in that case.
Yeah. And I even caught myself going down this rabbit hole of
We all do. We
this
all do.
generation sucks. This is better than that one. But I guess what I'm trying to say is a lot of people listening, you guys are like the managers, the directors, the leadership or the growing leadership. If you're a millennial, you may be one of the more senior people in your work group at this point. And the topic that we're going here is mainly that you at least understand where people are coming from. It's not their fault that that YouTube only serves up one side of the spectrum for them.
So, Lane, and that is a hard thing to explain, accept, and move forward. You can't change everybody, but you can change yourself. And so that is my call to everybody, including myself, is start with yourself. Acknowledge that beliefs you have could be challenged, and that's a healthy thing. If that happens, engage. Do not block off. The stuff you're talking about, the generation, is not necessarily that polarizing. We have differences between beliefs, and only if we choose not to work with someone because of their generation is this a problem. I don't see that being a common problem primarily because employers need employees, employees need jobs, and as long as we are collaborating towards the common end, I think we're fine, right? Is this going to escalate? Is it going to get worse? It might. I hope it won't. But our different beliefs can lead us to the point that we just blame each other as opposed to work together. That's another reason why we need to be careful about what we believe. The best feedback I ever got from a Vistage member was a retiring member in my Seattle group. After 20 years with Vistage, tell us one thing that you want us to take back as an absolute truth from you. And he smiled and said, okay, the thing I have learned the most is don't trust everything that you believe. In other words, have enough self-doubt to know that your beliefs may be just convenient truths that you subscribe to, and they may not be truths at all. You may feel strongly about something because you were exposed to that side of the argument. So just have enough grace in life to question yourself as well. I can probably give you a dozen aha moments for me for being very convinced that I believe something, only to learn that it was actually a very well constructed, convenient story, which prevented me from dealing with the things I didn't want to deal with. So my belief system, to a large extent, is self-serving, and I believe that is a choice for all humans. Yes, we will not always be wrong, but we will not always will be right either. So when we believe that we are right, take a little bit of grain of salt with it and just listen. Maybe we'll learn something that is going to surprise you. Moving on to the generation share characteristics. So these are generalizations, right? I don't have to go too deeply in them, but essentially there is truth to any generalization, and I think it's fine. This is inoffensive stuff. So baby boomers essentially are workers who value visibility. Why is that? They're not digitally integrated. They never were. Their belief is that I need to be visible. I need to be recognized. I need to voice my opinion, and I represent myself. They don't necessarily subscribe to the groups. They don't subscribe to the political beliefs as much. They're probably more on the conservative side, but that's not necessarily a rule. But the point about baby boomers is they're exiting the workforce at 10,000 employees per day. That's a huge number for the US. So if you think that every 30th person had a business, that means that we're having what? Every 30th person, that's 300 businesses a day that are being transferred or foreclosed on account of 10,000 people exiting, right? So that's a big thing, right? We believe that baby boomers, as they die out, and unfortunately it's already happening, the biggest transfer of wealth will be happening between them and possibly millennials of Generation Z. Why is that? Because most of the wealth, at least in the US, is held by baby boomers. Now, you can make that into a political platform and say that is not fair, but they're the oldest. They had worked the longest. Maybe the economy was on their side to make the most. Maybe that's not true for the following generations. But the simple fact is that they own the wealth, and they have gone through some of the most prosperous years that this country has ever seen. It was probably not easy for them either. So in other words, their work resulted in the wealth that we have today. So a little bit of gratitude would be good for us as well.
From an investing perspective, the narrative there is all these baby boomers are heavily invested in mutual funds, which got indoctrinated when they started working. What's going to happen when they start to retire and turn it to cash? I don't know. But as more for the workforce side, because that's your area expertise, Tomas, we solve issues in our little meetings, and sometimes somebody will have a baby boomer in their workforce. Talk a little bit generalities. Maybe somebody's listening and they're at director level. They have to deal with more of an obsolete worker, or maybe there's entitlement. Maybe just some generalities of kind of common problem that comes up. Just
The simple fact of the things is that the most experience is with the baby boomers. They are the most experienced group of people. They have seen the most. They may have acquired some good skills or bad skills along the way, culturally speaking. That may be not here, not there. Because they require visibility, they require respect as well. It's a prideful group of older people, and we need to be cognizant of that. So when you have a person that owns the knowledge, the best thing you can do is try to find a way to transfer that knowledge. This is where we have a gap between generations, which makes that very hard. As from the psychology, as you grow older, time passes by slowly, so you look maybe a little bit slower and more relaxed than the younger people. Younger people are more impatient and more interested to get to the point. And so temperament-wise, you have a delta between younger and older people by definition. So putting them together to have a teacher and a pupil a relationship, it's a little bit hard. It doesn't work that well. However, what is going to happen if we don't transfer the knowledge from baby boomers? We'll need to reacquire it. And that's probably unnecessary loss that we are seeing very many times. Baby boomers are not out. They are old, generally speaking, or older than any other generation. The youngest ones of them are there in their early 60s. So that's not all. One of the things that I'm seeing that is a trend in Europe and Japan is they call it a silver tsunami, where older people are re-entering the workforce, not as full-time, but as part-time employees. Why is that? They don't want to work as hard. They simply don't have the energy, they don't have the need, but they want to be useful. And employers can utilize them. They can call them to action by working with them and trying to find how to integrate them as a transfer of knowledge type of task where they can still do some useful things. They can still own some part-time functions in the company, which, let's face it, if we have 3 baby boomers that we probably, and all of them work third of the time, that would cover the needs of one full-time person that we can't hire because there is not enough people out there. So in other words, a little bit of finding flexible ways to re-engage all the workforce into our workplace is a good thing. It is something that we don't normally think of, but it is something that is relatively easy to do, except that not even baby boomers expect that they are going to find accommodations at the workplace. So in other words, what does that mean? It means that we need to be public, that we need to be intentional, that we need to invite them, which means in our job postings, we need to say, hey, we have solutions that allow people over 60, and you don't have to say the age, but you can say baby boomers, you can say semi-retired people, whichever way you want to talk about it is fine. Or we are going to accommodate your needs for a part-time position with us. And some position will allow that. Not all of the position will be good for that. Some of them are too straining and physically demanding, but many of the position probably are stand a chance and are a possibility to do that. They have experience. They know how to do it. At this point, they are not the youngest and the most energized people, but they certainly have what it takes, and they are relatively easy to integrate into the workflow. The problem with the generational gap still remains, and that is, I think, slightly we're going to talk about it. There's a call to action there. If you have a 20-something-year-old person that needs to work with a 60-year-old person, you will need to be able to help that relationship grow. Right? In some cases, it will be there naturally, and that's wonderful. In some cases, you will need to basically make sure that we understand how the workflow flows so that there are not undue expectations. But the opportunity, what I'm trying to say, is to re-engage the baby boomers in the workplace, primarily because we are dealing with a very low unemployment and we need more people. This is that untapped area of the workforce that would probably make sense for us to re-engage, which would be mutually beneficial. They would live longer. They would have a meaning in their lives, and we would benefit from experienced personnel. Hopefully, the line will find a way to transfer some of the knowledge into the younger people. And for that, I think it's going to be case-by-case basis. You have to have a good teacher and a good student. So odds of that happening are 25%, but we can certainly try to make processes, put them in place that would enable that to happen. That's the baby boomers. Right. So Generation X is the current generation that is mostly in charge. Why is it? Because they're in their 50s. So they have plenty of experience and an opportunity to grow to the top of the companies. They're well educated and independent. They're rising in seniority. 10 years from now, they'll start retiring, without a doubt, right? At this point, they are probably the most influential, not the biggest, but the most influential group. They're facing a problem that baby boomers are exiting, and management now needs to find a place to replace baby boomers with someone. That's a big challenge. Baby boomers and millennials are roughly the same size generations. One would argue that would be an easy fix. Nevertheless, it isn't, because the functions in which baby boomers were good at, millennials are not. The jobs that you have mentioned, bus driver, technician, welder, right? Those were the things that baby boomers in general were really good at, amongst a variety of many other white collar functions, right? And there's very few millennials that strive to become good at hands on work. So that is creating a strong unemployment at the entry level positions because you can't hire somebody without experience to be a welder. You become a welder over time, and there is no experienced welders to hire. In a sense, that creates that complaint that entry level positions in welding are available. I don't want that. And so what does that mean? I'm going to go into something that is white collar and try to prove myself there. That means that the technical positions that create the bloodstream of this country economically are going to remain undersupplied. They're going to remain empty. And that's a big problem. So in other words, this is where millennials and Gen X, even though they're same in number, are not replacement for each other 100%.
I'd like to get your quick opinion on that. More and more people are going to college. Do you think that's a right thing, or how do you think this will play out? Will there be some kind of like bubble bursts in the next 20, 50 years, or?
The psychologists and economists believe that this is a self-fixing issue, right? It basically the market will decide, right? We may be in a situation that the most respected, not the most respected, but at least well-respected positions will be positions of handyman, right? Because that's what society needs to continue to exist. And we relearn that a blue collar is not a shameful place to be. We'll relearn that people who are good with their hands are necessary part of the society, and we start paying them more. That is a question. Will at that point somebody has have to suffer? And I think with this convergence of AI and the need for blue collar jobs, the college is becoming a less relevant skill. And if it continues to go that way, chances are that college education will be something that the elites, intellectual elites, go to, but the majority of the middle class has a different kind of a path to their life. And that's not necessarily good or bad. It is just something that we may want to think about. When I talk about elites, I'm not talking about the richest people. I'm talking about people most likely to succeed in education. I'm not talking about everybody going to the college just to get a degree and then work in a different field. I'm talking about intellectual elites that are interested in making college into something that is expanding the boundaries of society, not college being a minimum requirement. Because at this point, I think we're in this weird state of not knowing where to go. College degree doesn't mean much, but it's expensive to get, right? That is something that is holding back a huge group of young people. It is really sad that is the case. But that means that the college did not result in the ROI that they expected. And so at some point, that bubble will burst. And it may not be a financial bubble, it may be an ideological bubble that say, why would I go to college and spend $150,000 getting a degree when I can start as a welder for $200,000 a year? That becomes to be a self-fixing thing where the demand adjusts to the market needs, and that basically can change who is getting paid how much. And if you can choose from 10 college graduates and you don't need any college graduates, right, you're not going to pay them much.
Yeah,
So,
intellectually, I get it. It's just hard. Like the people who are listening, sending their kids to college, you'd still do that, even if a welder or a handyman is paid 200 grand a year.
yeah, but basically these choices are these choices, right? So I'm not saying that any of this is easy, right? It isn't. And again, keep in mind that when you get to a certain level of economic prosperity, like the US has, you start assuming that's a minimum requirement. And that leads to the high level of entitlement. If you believe that your children should be better paid than you are, at some point that will not be true. At some point that will simply not be possible to be true for everybody to be well better paid than you are, right? Well, we're going to talk about why that is not likely. It is not likely because the demographics are such that we have a shrinking working class and expanding dependence class, right? So we have more retirees at some point than we have the workers. And when that happens, what can we do? That means that every employed person needs to work for two and share the money that they make. So that is a little bit of an ambiguous thing. The value of college, we already know that AI is replacing financial, it's replacing marketing, it's replacing writing, it's replacing a whole bunch of entry level functions. And many of the companies already are benefiting from having much smaller such departments because AI can fix those things, or should I say, can fill in those jobs. So that is a simple reality of today. And this is 2024 today, 2025 around the corner. So this will change. It will probably accelerate. It will accelerate in terms that AI is replacing more things. It's more useful to us. We can achieve as much or more with lower number of people. So this is now, I think, in this particular time, we're not about AI. We're about people that can use AI, right? So in other words, when you think about your kid that's going to go to college, well, make sure that they're choosing a degree and they're being sensitive to how AI is going to impact that degree, right? Think about the future. Having a college degree without a function is not really useful. It is just part of the reality that we have to learn to live with. There is no wishful thinking there because market will do what market does. So if you plan to have your kid in marketing, I think that's going to be probably, if it's successful, it's going to be a job in AI. How to get the best result with minimum input from AI, right? Will that hold true forever? I don't know. But at least in the next number of years, as AI gets stronger, certain functions, certain degrees will start losing value. Why? Because AI can do it for no money, right? So that is the reality of what we need to do. In other words, again, being in this blocked off gardens of Eden that basically says everything looks to be wonderful or everything looks to be horrible. Both of those are blocked off realities. And so the question is, if we remove ourselves from these wishful beliefs, what is reality? And reality is that currently we are understaffed as an economy. We need more people, and opportunities for us is to either get more people which don't exist or rely on existing people that can deliver more. People that can deliver more are people who can use AI today. When it comes down to the mostly white collar functions, when it comes down to the factories, when it comes down to the production and operational stuff, we're still heavily dependent on the people until potentially robotics come about. And I have lower level of belief that robotics will be coming out quickly because there is a physical cost to them, unlike AI that is scalable on a much, much lower level basis. I think if you want to have a stable life, if you want to have stable life today, your stable life is going to be probably more if you're hands-on in a warehouse than it would be if you are in marketing team, because marketing may be replaced by AI soon. Warehousing doesn't stand a chance of replacing, at least in the move with the physical goods. So we're going through that shift right now. And I'm talking this globally. I'm not talking for every single individual. We all have the right to decide what is right for them. And many of us will decide that we don't want to work in the warehouse. And I get it. The question is, where is the mass of the jobs going to remain to be? It is going to be in those jobs where there is not enough candidates, but the industries are growing.
Yeah, and who knows where the ball is going to bounce off the wall. Just like with my company is more of a white collar company. At one time, we went overseas, used globalization to find cheaper workers. But recently, with AI, we found that we didn't need those lower level white collar workers, and AI replaced them. And I'm like, well, who knows where this is going to end up? It's
Well,
dynamic.
we are observing. We're observing. Like you, I had EA, executive assistant, who was abroad, and her value versus Copilot. If I'm willing to work a little bit harder, I can save lots of money. That's basically what I learned. And that's not great. I don't like when machines replace people because I'm sad for the people. But the simple reality is that the economy doesn't care about that. The demographics are not going to pay attention to that. The history is not going to pay attention to that. Those are our stories of today that we can just bend with. Just like in the 1990s, if you did not know how to operate a computer, you were useless to many companies, right? Some people didn't. And that was a big emotional shift for many people who chose not to participate. They got obsoleted, or at least they got pushed to the end of the line of the people who were laggards and learned to use computers way late, right? So some of these things are not about emotional, how well they feel. They're about the realities you need to accept and roll with.
Yeah, the saying is if you don't evolve, you die. Those people who didn't bother learning about Google or search engines or computers, they eventually got obsolete in the workforce. And today you have access to AI. It's more about being a prompt engineer and asking the right questions or telling the AI to do what you want.
That's
I
correct. You can
still
work
think
from.
there's a lot of people out there who still haven't even played around with the thing.
Fortunately, it's not that hard to learn. So I hope that that switch is going to be relatively quick, right? But you're right. It is right now using AI depends on how well you can integrate or interact with AI. Probably it has to do with understanding what you're trying to achieve. Probably it has to do with other things as well. But one of the main skills is asking the right questions in the right way. And again, I am not an expert in AI. I rely on AI experts to tell me what's going on, and this is what I'm hearing. So let's take a look at, we don't have to go much deeper into this stuff. We'll just skim over some slides. Generation Y. So when you talk about collaborative and impact-oriented generation rising in seniority, if you were to take the personality test and compare them to any other generation, they would not be any different. In other words, the collaborative aspect is coming from the belief that I do not have to hold on to the knowledge as much as my dad and my uncle and the previous generation did. I can help others because for both of us, the truth is that we can look it up. So the collaborative aspect is more in the expectation that when millennials join the workforce, they expect that other people will help them succeed. That's the collaborative aspect. They do not expect what the previous generation believes is that you have to prove yourself to everyone and you're going to be on a probation, so to speak, as far as the social acceptance goes, until you prove yourself as a valid member. They believe that if you know this stuff, why don't you tell me what it is so we both can know so I can get it done, right? This is not what the previous generations believed, and this is where the gap became obvious. There has been many cases of expectations that were met with a surprise, and it comes from the belief, and part of it has to do with schooling and education and the function of family within your formative years. All of that has been changing. Simply put, who was a disciplinarian in your life, Lane? Was
They,
forcing you to do things you didn't want to do.
my parents,
See, that's not everybody's experience. Traditionally, that's where the disciplinarian would be. And this is for audience to decide. In many cases, it was the teacher. So in other words, the only person that really forced you to do stuff was the teacher. And when you got into trouble with teacher, your parents would go with you to confront the teacher with you.
this is why I resonate more with Gen X, but this is part of the reason why.
So this basically changed the dynamics. That was my experience as well. My parents were the ones who were setting a high standard for me to live up to, right? At some point, I was setting a standard for me to live up to. My teachers were there to grade me and teach me, right? But they were not there to motivate me, right? When you think about what my expectation from that kind of scholastic upbringing was when I joined the workforce, it was that my boss is going to set the objective and I will meet them or exceed them. And of course, I want to exceed them every single time. When you think of the other world, of the world of millennials and generation after, where their teachers were there to help them out, motivate them, convince them, but not discipline them into anything, because that became all of a sudden unacceptable as far as the expectation from the parents. They moved from that collaborative experience with their teachers to a workplace, and they expected that collaborative experience would continue, that the people that are paying you would also help you be successful. And there was a shocker that existed there for many years, and it's probably going to exist for the future generations as well, because school is different than work, yet it is the closest approximation of your experiences as a young person. So if you expect that the way that your teacher treated you in the past is the way that your employer will treat you in the future, that oftentimes does not happen that way. And I recently read an article from somebody who may have been a Zoomer or a Generation Y, younger one, about the realization that that is. And the article was written from the heart, and I applaud the person from being open. And he or she said something along the lines, now I'm realizing that at work, It's not the same as you being at college. In the college, you are a customer, and the teachers need to teach you and they need to evaluate you, but ultimately, you're the customer that needs to be satisfied. At work, you're no longer the customer, you're a service provider. And your employer is judging whether that service is good, and customers are either buying or not buying. So, in other words, there is no loyalty, there is no customer service in the existing customers, in the existing employers, like it was in college, because the relationship is different. And that was the big moment after about losing 6 jobs. This person said, maybe the problem was with me. And yes, the problem is with me, and this is the problem. They are not there to help me. I'm not their customer, I'm their employee. And employee means that I'm the service provider to my employers. And that was a little bit hard and harsh to many people to hear, but I think it's a good insight and something that will be obvious to the previous generations.
But as a Gen X, Gen Y, millennial, it is what it is, and these are the people you're stuck with or you have to have more in the future.
Correct. Correct. So I think that the rub between existing generations, baby boomers that are exiting Generation X, millennials that are a hybrid, and the younger generation is that we have a kind of like a transition that is happening in the workplace as well as in the education system that is affecting the expectations within the workplace. And we are struggling in that area. Collectively, the entire Western civilization is dealing with that for more than one. And a part of it has to do with the fact that we don't have enough employees. In other words, the unemployment is relatively small in the first world. The demand of the new employees are high and illogical to the existing employees. The younger generation feels entitled to those calls. They want to be treated better. They want to be paid more. They want to be appreciated at a high degree than was true in the past. And the system is starting to really squeak. It's not set up in such way that we can have highly paid entry-level positions because the economics of the system simply don't work. So that remains to be a little bit of a kind of like a social justice kind of question, which does not have an answer to itself. I'm representing here generations, representing the economy is not set up in such way that we have equality in pay between experienced and inexperienced people, right? That's a little bit of a problem right now that in many parts in Seattle, the entry wage is over $20, right? Why is that? Because nobody wants to work for less than that. This is not how much the work is worth. This is about how much employees require. And because they're in high demand, they can do that. The problem with that is that a business owner still has to make the ends meet. And sometimes they can't if they have to pay people more than the money makes, more than the business makes, right? And so that is a little bit of there's lots of pressure on the business owners, but there's high expectations about them. There is a call for social justice and equality amongst pay and all sorts of different groups within their society. All of that stuff is not necessarily wrong or bad. It is just not aligned with the economic realities. And so that is something that we'll have to continue to struggle through. There is no answer that I can provide. So going on to the Generation Z Zoomers. So they're young, they're optimistic and risk-averse group. They're lacking workplace experience. So they're basically now, if you're going to talk about the millennials, Generation Z is born between 96 and 2010, 2012. So the ones that were born in the late 1990s are now in their mid-20s, mid to late 20s almost. And there is a challenge. There is a challenge there with integrating the generation. I don't know how pervasive the challenge is, but I know that many small business owners are finding it difficult to have younger people working their business because the churn is very large. The upset, emotional upset they bring at the company is very high. And the business owners are a little bit discouraged, at least in the areas where I work, which is area where you are and Pacific Northwest. So I don't think this is a national thing. I wish I had better news to report from other areas, but it seems that there is unwillingness from the entry-level workers to do entry-level jobs. The last is Alpha, too early to tell, seem to be very different from Y and Z. Some people hope that from the demographic perspective, you basically have a switch between belief systems between different generations, and that is When you look at your parents, when you look at the older people and you see the mistakes they're making, it become obvious to the following generation and they do the opposite. Whether that's going to happen with the alphas or not, it's too early to tell. But we may have a shift in the belief systems. Some interesting things are about political stuff, which I don't know whether it's true or not. There have been reports that the younger generation are more risk averse, which means more conservative in their beliefs. To which extent and which areas that is true or not, I don't really know. But we do see that there is a difference between the Generation Alpha and the Zoomers, where Zoomers were probably closer to how millennials were when they were young, which is optimistic but risk averse. There was some similarity in that. It's hard to tell where they're trending, but let's face it, Generation Z and Alphas together are a smaller group than the millennials alone. So as far as their impact and influence, it's going to be lower than the millennials. So culturally speaking, the largest group is driving the cultural standards. So in which case, it is probably up to the millennials to establish what is it that matters and how are we going to approach it, because they're up and coming generation. And they're much bigger than Generation X as well. So in other words, that is going to be an interesting thing to observe.
And maybe I should ask in the beginning, in that graph, these are in the workforce, not necessarily the population groups in America.
This is the population.
Okay.
But you can basically guess that population very closely resembles the workforce as well, right? You could argue that basically baby boomers, anybody who is 66 or older is probably retired or on the way to retire. So if you take a look at baby boomers, the large group that they are, the yellow here, half of them are over 66, which would probably mean, to answer your question, that they're not a big workforce group. They're a big group of living individuals, half of them who are retired. And that is causing a concern for the economy moving forward. Because as we get into younger generation that don't engage with the jobs that we have available and older generation that are retiring, we have a rising group of people who don't work. And that creates a need for taxation, need for some kind of alignment in the economic system to be able to support a non-producing workforce that no longer works. So what does that mean? That typically means that people who are working need to cover the expenses of those that do not. Baby boomers are in their 70s. Youngest ones are 59. The oldest one are 78, right? So basically average is about 70. The short story here is that what we need to make sure is that we leverage them while they're available. Because of the expanding lifespan and the health that many of them still enjoy, they may be useful employees. So I would suggest that when we can't find somebody young that we can invest for next 10 years, we can probably find somebody that we can invest part-time in the next 5 years and cover our needs for now.
The other point to this, if people are reading between the lines with hiring a younger person, is that you're going to go through the turnover, right? You're be their first, second employer. They realize it's not what it's cracked up to be. And guess what? Being employed, working at a job, running a business isn't all what it's cracked up to be, but it might take them a few employers to figure that out. Maybe 4, 5, 6, who knows? But if you want to take the chance with that and go through a few iterations of people, or maybe go after this person riding the silver wave. I don't know, right?
It's important that we present options, and then individuals can decide what they resonate with, right? If you think about the beliefs, so baby boomers would be surprised with somebody who wants to jump from a job to a job. It doesn't make it wrong. It just makes it to their system of beliefs that would be unusual. Generation X is now the average age of 49, so it's anywhere between 44 and 60. They are mostly in the leadership. They're trying to do their best from the perspective of integrating the workforce into unified workforce. They're not generation baby boomers. They're a different generation. They understand the importance of the digital era. So I think they're hybrid enough that they can understand the generation they follow. The question is if their level of flexibility is going to be sufficient to integrate the Generation Z and out, right? That's TBD. Millennials are probably the most important generation. So they're basically between 36 and 43, middle of the road, the sweet spot of the workforce, right? They have witnessed the stability they have in 9/11. They have seen the meltdown of economy. They have seen the rise in China. They believe that the world is intuitive. Knowledge is a click away. Electronic communication is normal, which is probably their belief that they share with the following generation. This is different than the previous generation that believe that the communication is in person. Child change in family hierarchy. This is parent is a friend, disciplinarian is a teacher, and then teacher is an employer. So that basically is this teacher equals manager. So if you're my manager, the expectation that millennials originally had, you're not going to just give me a job, you're also going to teach me how to be successful in it. And that was you. That was typically your success was your own. That was the belief of prior generations. Millennials started changing that. Let me ask you as a manager and a member of Vistage, if you were to hire someone, how much are you responsible for their success?
Before I was an enlightened individual, I would have thought it's 100% them, but I realize it is my responsibility. I am the leader.
You're right. That's the transformation we're going through, right? It used to be that you could proclaim and set the direction and everybody would do their best to follow. Now you have to set the direction and break it down to the individual level so that people can see how they fit in. And nobody
Yeah.
can do that other than the leader.
Part of it is just like empathy. Like it wasn't too long ago I was an employee and I don't really consider myself a great employee. So I can see where if somebody comes across as Gen X, baby boomer type, that's not gonna fly. You could scare me, I think, but these new guys, I'm just like, it's a different world out there. It's been 21 years since I graduated high school, and I'm just taking my daughter to all these preschool interviews, and the way these kids learn is so different these days.
It is.
I can't imagine how they're gonna come out in 20 years.
It remains to be seen. They're going to be formed along the way with formative experience that they will be experiencing. So we can't predict that. What we can accept is that for our success and success of our employees, today's workforce requires a different management style than what we maybe were given when we were young. And that means that the proclaim and declare style of management is no longer alive. We have to be like servant leaders in a sense. And at least in current jargon, that's the closest I can think of, where you not only tell people what they need to do, that you also help them achieve it. That is sometimes tough. It is tough from the perspective of scalability, where you as a leader may not have the time to help everybody in the organization. And so the question is, how do we make that style of management become prevalent through the leaders and levels in our hierarchy so that we don't necessarily have to be responsible for everyone, but we're responsible for the people that work closely with us only. Just from the scalability perspective, that's a necessity. It may feel heartless that the CEO does not have time for me and I'm working for somebody 3 layers removed. My expectation as a new employee may be that the CEO is going to pay attention to me specifically, but the reality of things is that is very hard to implement. So we'll see how this thing goes. The only thing is we can do is make sure that our internal cultures of our companies are up to date so that we can work with the people that are coming in. It's a big challenge. Millennials are motivated by the meaningful work. They're passionate about collaboration. They need actionable feedback, meaningful feedback. In my talking to millennials, they like to be mentored. They respect experience, but they shy away from authority. And so the question is, how do we make sure that means that our leadership style needs to be aligned with that? We need to provide value to them as well. And so what does that value mean? It means I'm not going to only hold you accountable, I'm going to help you become accountable. It's not much different from parenting. And that is something that most people did not bring into the workplace, even though they were parents. The way they dealt with their employees was different than the way they dealt with their children. And I think that paradigm is changing. The way you deal with your children is the way you deal with your employees, and you wish them all the best and you help them out be their best version of themselves. I think that's a requirement that millennials are kind of have brought into the workforce, and good for them.
Yeah, no longer the days of the silent generation of sit down, do your work, and shut the F up, right?
Exactly. Those days are good, and I think it's good that they're gone. I think it's a needed thing. We just need to see how that all works economically so that we can be a productive economy moving forward because it has its challenges. The more you appreciate people, the more you pay them, the less profit you have, the slower your company will grow. So the question is if that is okay. And if it isn't, that's something that we'll have to decide in the future and see how it goes. So Generation Z is the youngest generation, currently at the age of 22 at the average. Lots of things to say about them. They're not very good communicators at work. They're good at communicating via smartphone, but they're not good in person as much. They haven't learned that. I think that is what it is. Their formative years were in front of a touchscreen. Their personal interaction at work may need to be done through the texting and social media. I'm not sure where is that going to go. The thing is that millennials and Generation Z are a US phenomenon. Why do I say that? This bump here that we are seeing in millennials, the bump, which means there was more babies born in that time frame, does not exist elsewhere. So Japan, Europe, Australia, China, they do not have a growth in their population. They actually have a millennial exist as group of people born between 1984 and 96. They exist as people, but they're not a large group. They're a declining group. And so when you take a look at the trends elsewhere in the first world, primarily, everything from baby boomers and Generation X down to today is a declining line of people. So in other words, fewer and fewer babies are born. So millennials are not a global phenomenon. They're a US phenomenon only. So keep that in mind. In other words, you do not have Europeans that are large in number that are millennials. You have millennials in Europe, but they're a smaller group, the Generation X, for example. In Japan, even worse. In Russia, even worse. In China, even worse. So basically, we have this tendency in the global population to have a declining number of babies, which means that this bump, like millennials, is not common. It was a US only phenomenon. And this is a US primarily only presentation. So just so that you know the difference between what is here and what is elsewhere. So being that these are declining generations, the question is how successfully can we integrate them into the workplace and how successful do they want to be integrated into the workplace? And that remains to be a question. There are always going to be some that are going to be just fine and they're going to be doing a great job, and some that are going to start businesses and be an exception to the rule. The question is majority. And one of the things that lacks in the Generation Z is the understanding of meritocracy. So our economy in general is based on the concept of meritocracy, which means the more you work, the more you get paid. Shortest version of it. The higher your contribution, the higher your value as an employee, and consequently you get paid. So that means that you're compensated based on the merit. That's the fundamental things of any capitalist society in the world, including all of the first world countries. That is not the case with socialist countries, and I'm not going to get into that, but meritocracy is based on your work amount and your success equals how much money you make. It seems that Generation Z does not understand that concept, or at least does not behave as if they agree with that concept. So that is a bit of a challenge because it's a large bridge to cover. It is a large bridge to cross, primarily because we do not take time to explain this concept to one another. We assume that understanding is there. And very rarely when you come to the new employee and tell them, do you know why you're going to pay less or more? Many of them will not be able to explain that, but you will not ask the question. And this is not you. This is very common with anybody out there. We do not review how little or how much younger generation know that is in alignment with what we take for granted. And this is a first generation that is challenging some really basic assumptions about contribution to the workplace. And that's why I think it stands a bigger bump to overcome, because perhaps employers are not aware of the need to discuss the fundamental basis of employment. Consequently, their employees will never learn what is expected from them. It's a kind of a blind spot that doesn't get revealed because we don't think we have to talk about it. That's the belief on the employee or in the employer side. On the employee side, they don't even know they need to discuss about meritocracy. They don't even have to believe that they have to understand what causes them to make more or less money. They don't understand why we keep them or not keep them. They don't necessarily understand those things. We assume that they do, and that's what we get widens.
So I think the way I correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I've understood this, and I'm still wrapping my head around, is with the older guys, Gen X, baby boomers, they had really no insight into company financials or the health of the company. The millennial, Gen Zs and beyond, they need to somehow feel or open the books to them, have more insights, transparency, and that might help them have a better connection with the employers. That kind of that's the way I read it.
maybe opening the books to someone who thinks that all of the profits are their own may not help them. So basically, explaining what the profits are and how the economics of the company work would be relevant. It is not something that most private business owners feel inclined to do because they are having a business. That's basically the primary thing. The private businesses are not supposed to share their private financial data, and they're not required. So you're not going to find many business owners willing to say, this is how much money we make, this is how much money I'm going to keep, and this is how much money I'm going to divide between all of you, right? That is not something that business owners will typically do in a capitalist world. I'm not saying it's good or bad, it is what it is. So in other words, having that requirement that you're going to open up your books to me is probably not going to be something that's going to happen very often. I don't think that's where the problem is. The older generations, we lived by the experience of the previous generation. What is required at work? For me, that was something I learned from my father, right? I don't know where you learned how how the world revolves and what is expected of you as an employee. One day, when you were a kid and you were talking to someone, did you have an idea as to what is going to make you a superstar in your work if you wanted to learn that? Who told you those stories?
Maybe I just didn't have it. Just listen to everything your boss says and do what you're told.
See, that's an interesting thing. For me, my dad was an executive, and for me personally, it was very important to understand. And he told me about many good and bad sides of working for an international company. I understood that there are politics involved. I understood that he was well respected because he was a hyper performer. I understood that him waking up at 4:45 every morning meant something, and that was his sacrifice in order to do and achieve these things. I think I understood those things without questioning. And so later on, when the time came for me to perform at my work, all of those things were minimum requirements for myself to live up to those standards. The question is, if you never had those life-forming discussions with your father or whoever was a disciplinarian in your life when you were a 5, 6, 10-year old, right? If you never had those discussions and you weren't interested in having them, what would that mean regarding your ability to integrate yourself into the workplace if you never thought about what is required?
I just did the best I can, and then I got a self-confirming bias. That was the way to do it. So
So
now I see why I assume or I look towards other people. Why do I need to give you the freaking instruction manual? Figure it out on your own because I did it.
that's the replicated behavior through generation that has been working all the way to Generation Z, right? Millennials have figured it out on their own, and they are fully integrated and very useful members of the society with a growing future, right? Economy is not great, so that is question is whether they're going to benefit from it or not. So that's something we can discuss separately. They have formed and accepted, possibly to the fact that they were hybrid and they understood that they can learn both from what Google tells them and what a person tells them. They learn both ways. So in other words, they have subjective and objective and internet-based opinions. They did not put all of their beliefs into a serialized group of opinions that they liked, that excluded any opinions that they didn't want to hear, which is, I think, what's happening with the younger generations, right? In other words, they were getting the truth served their way to a new media, which in those days was internet. If you were to now eliminate anything you don't want to hear, the question is, would you hear the things that would eventually make you successful? When I was a kid, I needed to hear these things. My dad knew that if I don't know these things and agree with them and accept them, I'm going to be a failure in my life. That is what he believed. Doesn't matter if he was right or wrong. That is what he believed, and that's what he transferred to me. Right now, the question is, if all you're seeing is that kids of your area, those that are super successful are the ones that are influencers on YouTube, for example, and that is all you know, you're going to replicate only that. And if you're not good at being an influencer, you're not going to feel very good about yourself. And that is going to lead you down the very negative spiral of personal negativity, but you never worked on the realistic, real objectives. You worked with a perceived one version of success, which wasn't even the most common version of success. It was just the most visible one. And that is my fear with the Generation Z, is that the source of information they get is very biased, and perhaps their success is going to be in learning what they don't want to hear. And at this point, the way that social media is set up, it is unlikely that's going to happen organically. So the question is, What do we need to do as employers when a person that does not understand these things very well or does not agree with them fundamentally? What do we need to do? And that is where the rub starts. We worked Vistage quite a bit about trying to understand that the things that we expect, the things that we as employers, as small business owners, as large business owners, the things that we assume are a common knowledge, we're learning that they're not a common knowledge. And they're certainly not a common accepted standard by which we operate. So you and I know that the harder we work and the more results we achieve in alignment with what we promise, the happier our customers and employees are going to be, which means that we put ourselves online for our personal success. I know that's through you. You do a great deal of effort to find the financial deals, to vet them, confirm them, to project them, to analyze them. None of it is easy. And all of it is very specialized work. And you do a remarkable good job in that. But what if you didn't know that's what it took? Where would you start? How would your life unravel? You certainly wouldn't be in your situation. You would not be a leader of a successful company. So that is the question. The question is, how do you bridge the basic level of knowledge that leads to some kind of a sustainable success, or at least survival, if you don't have those beliefs and you're resisting them because most of your generation is resisting. I was a teacher in the so Young Entrepreneurs Academy here in Bellevue in Washington, where the objective was to bring in young high school students and teach them how to do business. And I had a class of about 20, and this was extracurricular activities. I probably got the students from better schools, and these kids were absolutely phenomenal. But what we didn't lack was willingness to learn, openness to learn, and hunger for more. So I know that all of that stuff exists, but I will tell you that Young Entrepreneur Academy is not available to everyone. This was something that was done through the Chamber of Commerce in Bellevue. When parents would come and pick up these kids, these were Mercedes, Rolls Royces, and the similar cars. These were creme de la creme of the society of people who saw benefit in putting their children into this kind of experience. These were not your everybody's middle class kids. And that was an interesting thing, is that the awareness of what it takes for you to succeed in parents reflects in where they put their kids. And here we had overachievers putting their kids into a only class that I knew around that was teaching people about the realities of starting your own business. So that is something that is lacking currently in education, and certainly lacking as an accessible, easy to digest block of information that exists for most kids. And then, of course, when I talk about this thing to my Vistage members, majority of them would say, "Hey, can you tell me more about that program? How do I put my kids into it?" They are also realizing that their children do not know the basics of what does it take to generate success. And that's multiple failings of the system, but ultimately a necessity if we want to see our kids survive and succeed. So that is, I think, the challenge right now that we have with the younger generations, is that at some point it's going to be harder and harder to integrate them. Why? Because the spiral of lack of self-confidence, the spiral of recognizing that you can't do what brings you success, leads you to less success and less success. And so at some point, we have seen that in the 90s in China, we have a lost generation where, under their circumstances or their cultural limitations, they had a generation of young graduates between 1990 and 2000 that simply could not integrate themselves into society. And to this day, majority of those people are not integrated into society and are living a very separate and solitary life compared to the social structure of Japan. We've seen that basically a whole generation can be excluded from the future based on their formative years in early beginnings. And unfortunately, in Japan, it's called the lost generation. Right. I hope that is not the case with the Generation Z, but I think part of the information they need to know is not available to them readily, and they're not seeking it. So the question is, what is it that we as employers have to do? And I think that's an open question at this point.
Before we totally bash on these Gen Zingers, whatever you call them these days, when I read through this, and this is like the third time I've seen this presentation, maybe this is just like a positive belief, but it seems just like the millennials, if you're able to get them on board and seeing the long-term mission, that you can get a lot more out of them than the status quo. Certainly more than your normally motivated baby boomer or Gen.
I think you can get the same. So I don't think that Generation Z is in any way worse or better than the previous generations, right? They're still the same people with the same needs, same drives, same capabilities, same IQ, same EQ, you name it, right? Nothing has changed to cause Generation Z to in any way be different, better, or worse than the previous generation. What they lack is the insight. What they lack is the view of what does it take for them to be successful. I think that was lost in their education and somewhere in the social media and the information they're exposed. I brought this Young Entrepreneur Academy as an example of working with Generation Z, that they are as capable as anybody that has ever been, which means no less or more than the previous generations, if you give them the information and they eat it, they take it, they digest it, they come up with a billion things. From this group of 20 people, we launched 20 companies with 20 different products. One of them actually placed herself second in the US champion of all of the businesses that were competing in the Young Entrepreneur Academy in 1 year. We have developed some pretty good talent and the solutions that could compete on the national level. We're not talking about characteristic of the generation. We're talking about beliefs of the generation. And the beliefs of the generation are based on the information that is accessible to them, that they have accepted. I think that's where we were failing them. And so the question is, when you have somebody who does not agree with the rules of the game and tries to play differently, the game differently, and fail at it, that's a pretty bad experience of growing into failure. And at some point, you will either have an epiphany, like the kid that wrote the article did, or you will start believing that you are not good enough, or you will turn on the society and say the society is rejecting me. Those are basically the three most common outcomes. And what does that mean? That means that we have one point of contact, and that is if they apply to their job, we can help them. If they apply to our job, if they come to our company, it may be hard because they may be on their sick job. They may have evidence that 5 companies prior to your own has failed them. And they may be externalizing their failure as other people's fault. And you are just another link in that chain of the society has failed me and I'm not enjoying it and I'm going to check out. Right? So that is the risk. That is the challenge. The challenge is, how do we make sure that they have a positive experience upon which they can build their own self-confidence and dedication and contribution to the society in a positive manner, because they do not have the information they need to be successful in many cases. And the only people that can get that information from are businesses they apply to and work with. The question is larger companies. Many young kids want to join the larger companies, and some of them do. And that is why we have a problem with working from home that does not add to this problem in a positive way. We set expectation from them and provide them with no culture to learn what is expected and how to achieve it. We allow them to work from home. We have closed down our offices. And what is the outcome? The outcome is that they will try and fail. They will not be able to figure it out themselves because there is no peer, there is no superiors, there is nobody to really support them if they're working from home. And so this problem escalates. So there are multiple things that are converging towards the same negative income that I think we as business owners need to engage to help that out.
I mean, that's the fear, right? If I'm hearing these younger guys, they need that in-person mentorship and
Of course.
face to face, but with the coinciding with the COVID, now we can all work from home and be almost as productive and happier because we don't have to commute.
And
Um,
there's truth to that, except when you are just starting, because then your formative years, that's learning the worst practices up front. Chances are that if you're given to your own devices, are you going to be disciplined and try to do everything the hardest possible way? Or are you going to be let yourself go and just do whatever minimum you need to do? Chances are that most people are going to go towards the most comfortable way of life, which does not mean that they're going to build the stamina to work productively from home without supervision. That's why offices are absolutely necessary. And
which
some
is
of
why
them
you're
are,
seeing the more progressive companies bring everybody back to the office.
I don't think that they're perceived as progressive by their employees. You will see lots of lash back at companies that are forcing back to work. Some of them simply can't do it. And I think that is debatable. I don't think that the truth needs to be in the office or out of the office. The question is, at which point are your employees disciplined enough to work from home as well as they could work from the office? What we have seen when the COVID started is that baby boomers struggled a great deal because they could not get used to the electronic communication methods. And that caused a lot of baby boomers, statistically speaking, to leave the workforce from the beginning of COVID all the way to today. We had a huge check out of people who were on the edge of retiring. They hurried it up and retired. Why? Because the life became too complicated for them, if you will, or too hard. Generation X did really well because they had the formative years in the office. They knew what was expected, and doing the same for work worked for most of them. Was not a universal hit. Not everybody did as well, but generally speaking, as a generation, they had so many years working in the office and setting their expectations and their routines set up for success that working from through Zoom and working from home did not change the beliefs. Millennials were okay. It was a little bit tough to onboard new millennials during the COVID because it was hard to communicate the cultural expectations. It was hard to communicate the actual expectation. And certainly it was hard to show them how to do everything without making some pretty big holes with your talking electronically. And that may have handicapped some people who were early in their career. Having said that, the youngest millennial were born in 96. So by the year 2000, they were already past the college years. So the COVID as a blocker of learning productive skills was probably impacting small number of millennials and a large number of Generation Z. That's where the problem is. Generation Z, if the youngest one were born, if the oldest one were born in 1996, they were 24 roughly, which means some of them were entering the workforce after college. Some of them were in the workforce for a few years, but not for many years. And then COVID happens. And so they have as many years in COVID as they did in the workplace. And that changes you, right? That changes your beliefs, changes your experiences. And so what happens after that? You come out of it with certain habits that may not be in your best interest towards success. So there's many things to be said about the trajectory of Generation Z. And that's why I'm concerned, is that I don't blame it on them. That's not a question of blame. They're as good as any other generation. The things that they know may be so different than the previous generations, because of the mode of learning. They don't have to retain anything. They can do tests with help of internet. Their communication is not in person. It is electronic primarily. So they don't have the social skills that are as developed as they could have been in a generation that was without phones. They can face a strong economy from the age of, let's say, 10 or 14 or younger, all the way into their startup years. So they are optimistic about what can be expected. And then they were hit by COVID, which changed everybody's expectations, independent of who you were, except they were more prone to be impacted because of their lack of experience, right? And now we're facing ups and downs in the economy, which have one thing that is remaining, and that is we are having low unemployment, which to them may mean there is an opportunity for them to be picky. And I don't blame them for it. That is the reality. If you're at high demand, you're going to be more picky than if you wouldn't be. The only thing is that doesn't put you in a position to learn. It puts you in a position to have an entitlement or to demand on other things and other people. So that is the problem, is that sometimes hard times force generations to transform by having collective beliefs change through the economic ups and downs. Generation Z is going through it real time with a shaky background, right? So that is the question. The question is, how can they integrate themselves in the times that are really up and down?
Yeah, and I know these conversations have even gone as far as you got some of your workforce that wants to do work from home 1, 2, 3 days a week, and some others, and you have people who abuse the policy. And then it seems like the general trend is to police people not on how much hours they're in the seat, but KPIs. And it's a difficult thing for any employer to figure that stuff out and hold everybody
It is.
accountable.
It is. And let's say I was your employee and you tell me, Thomas, I need you to achieve these three things. My anxiety may go through the roof because I don't know how to do them. But at least I know that they were done in the past and they can be done And I will either ask you or somebody else how to do that. Now, the belief system below that modus operandi is I am accepting your guidance. I'm accepting your direction, and I'm going to do everything I can to achieve it. Now, what if my belief system was you're full of it and I don't necessarily have to do what you say? How likely am I to go to the challenge of figuring things out and delivering what I did? Now, I'm not saying that this is a Generation Z belief system. I'm just saying that if the belief is that I do not have to do something because we are different in the very fundamental low level beliefs of what is my duty in your life and what's your duty in my life, if we disagree on that, we can have a pretty big gap in expected success. And therefore, your KPIs, as well defined as they may be, if they're clashing with my fundamental beliefs, they may be meaningless. Most of the time, they're not. The question is if we find that somebody is looking at us without conviction and intent to follow up on the things we ask them, is that a problem? Or does that mean that we who are setting the KPIs need to go deeper down and start a conversation about what is your function in the company? What do you believe is your function in your life? How are you going to achieve it? What is acceptable? What is unacceptable to you? The things that maybe sometimes that are necessary but not acceptable to you, what do you do then? You have many people who would say, the most important thing is family to me. Do you have any kids? No, I don't even have a girlfriend or a boyfriend, right? But the family is the most important thing to me, right? I'm not saying that the family is most important to me. What I'm saying is that work is not that important to me, right? That's the fundamental belief that stems from that. And so you as an employer now have to see whether this person has intent that is aligned with what you expect from them. That's the depth of discussion that sometimes we need to engage with, as uncomfortable as it may be, both for us and for them, and learn whether we have fundamental beliefs that are aligned with them being productive and pro company. And that's not something we ever had to do before. This is completely new. This is last 5 years type of stuff. So that is if we want to have, unfortunately, some of your research members, not in your group necessarily, but in other groups have asked me, Thomas, how do I set up a job profile for somebody and I don't want anybody below 40 to apply, right? Why is that? Some of the business owners are so bitter and so discouraged with what they get out of younger people that they don't want to waste their time. That's heartless. That's very one-sided, and I think that's not a good example to follow. I'm just giving it as an extreme example, but that's where how some business owners are starting to look at things is this is a problem that's bigger than I, therefore I cannot fix it. And the only thing I can do is avoid it. That's a very short-sighted and very short-term attitude about things. Granted, not everybody has the capability and intellect to be able to handle more difficult issues, but the more difficult issue here is how do we integrate a generation of people that frankly is necessary for us to have a productive society in the future. And whether we do it on our terms or on their terms, and whether there is a hybrid of those beliefs that needs to be achieved, which we don't even know about as of today. Those are the questions I can't answer, but they need to be asked.
I think we should all just invest in private equity plumbing companies when the droids come out.
Exactly. And just make sure that those droids are not too expensive and they don't break often enough, right?
Yeah.
Some of the things, I just want to close with some of the beliefs that we need to acknowledge. And that doesn't mean that we have to live by them. We just need to be aware of them. And these are some millennial things that are, you can tell me if you agree as a millennial. This is important. Why? Because the big decision makers in larger companies are older millennials, Generation X, and the leftover of baby boomers. So in other words, this may not be obvious to everybody. It would be interesting if we can uncover it to an extent. So the biggest fear is fear of failure, which is universal with any other generation. Difficulty promoting myself is a new problem, a prevailing problem still. Anybody who is an introvert or not comfortable promoting themselves will have this thing. The problem with, in this case, is that younger millennials do not have the ability to promote themselves in person because they never had to do it because of the digital era grow up experience. Okay, so here we're going to take a look at some of the hangups that are relevant just because the decision makers at workplace are either retiring baby boomers, Generation X predominantly, or the older millennials. So let's just take a look at whether there is any aha moments here in what are their personal beliefs and what are their fears coming from. And this is probably similar to the following generation, different generation, but the millennials are most prevailing, so we need to understand it. So the biggest fear of failure for the millennials is the biggest fear is fear of failure. And this is not remarkable. That has been the case with previous generation as well. So no change here. Next one is difficulty promoting yourself. So in person-to-person relationship, this is a little bit higher than it was before. And it probably has to do with the fact that millennials depend on digital communication more so than anybody else, or shares more so than the older generations. Difficulty networking, another case of interpersonal relationships, becomes a difficult thing. How important is networking today? It's important enough that it is presenting almost a 30% challenge because it is an expectations that you can't achieve, right? So millennials are more afraid of it than other generations. Again, I think probably because of the interaction that they're used to, which is mostly digital. Desire to avoid conflict that existed before, it was a little bit less pronounced. Why? Because in person-to-person relationship, you will have conflict you need to learn to deal with. In digital interactions, you probably will be able to avoid it. Lack of political savvy. This is an interesting one. I believe that younger generation and millennials don't believe this thing as much. They actually believe that they're quite politically savvy. So the fact that millennials believe that is probably a declining expectation generationally.
What does that mean? What is an example of that?
I think one of the ways of saying is understanding how the world works, understanding what is having strong political beliefs on one side, which I think they probably do, but understanding what does it take. Keep in mind, this is career goals. This is business. So what are the politics at workplace? How do I make sure that I'm liked? How do I make sure that I'm elected for the promotion? How do I make sure that I select the right person to be my peer? How do I make sure that I am in good terms with a winning party? How do I make sure that my boss respects me? That's basically the part that it's not all about heartless truth. It's not about, excuse my language, kissing butt. It is about having a good balance of relationships and saying the right thing in the right time, right? It's the politics general. But they would say that they do not have the well-developed political savvy for the workplace and career. They may be a little bit clumsy. Maybe they don't know when to speak. Maybe they don't know when not to speak. All of those things are something that you learn very early and naturally in a personal person-to-person relationships. But it is something that you never learn if you didn't have the personal relationships in the past. And that I think is something that millennials here are uncovering, that understanding the political savvy, being able to be polished and politically groomed at work is something that doesn't come natural to them. I think many people will say good for them. Many people will say not so good for them. I think that depends on what is the level of success you want to achieve. The higher you're in the company, the more politically savvy you have to be. Reluctance to reluctance to compete. I don't know if this is you or not, but essentially the lack of competitiveness usually is based on the fact that you don't believe you can succeed. My question would be whether this is related to something unique to millennials, like the fact that they are collaborative when it comes to sharing the knowledge, whether that maybe this is related to them comparing themselves to their elders, which is Generation X and Generation Z, that does not share knowledge as much as they do, in which case they would be underprivileged in competition because they simply know less. And the people that are older and more experienced know more. So maybe that's where it's coming from. I'm trying to understand it. I'm guessing here.
There's another movement out there, people on Reddit, people just give up, right? I think they call it I think in China, they call it the lie flat movement, where they just don't do anything. Like
Yeah,
they
that's
approach it.
quiet quitting here. It's the quiet quitting. And so, yes, it is very possible that it is that there are different phenomena are basically same thing with a different name. But quitting is basically being unwilling to participate or compete. And that could be related to depression, or it could be related to the lack of motivation, or it could be related to the lack of self-belief. I don't have an explanation for that, but yes, it is an existing thing.
That's the whole, people always said the meme is our grandpa, bought his house and it was like, what, $5,000 back then. Today it's like 500 grand. Your insurance and your taxes is the majority of your mortgage payment. How the hell does anybody get ahead in this era, right? That's what the younger people have to deal with.
That was something that every generation before had to deal with as well. It's just that we did not have social media to complain to everybody about.
Yeah, they were just unaware of it.
Correct. Correct. When I was having my first job, I was getting $52,000, and that was a very high salary for somebody who just graduated. And the cheapest house that I wanted to buy was 700,000, right? Except the house I wanted was in California, and I was getting 52,000 working in Texas. In Texas, I could buy a house, a nice house for 150,000, but I didn't want it. So if I was to complain to somebody, I would complain that the house that I want is out of my range. I would not admit that the house I don't want that I can afford is across the street from where I live, but I just don't want it. So I think there is something to be said about that. There are parts of the country that are cheaper than the rest of them. But if you're expecting that you will be able to afford a house in the area where you are, that is new. That was not a belief system for my generation. If you wanted to buy a house, you would either buy a condo or you would look for an area where you can find a job and the houses are affordable, and you would start your life there. And then maybe 4 or 5 houses down the line, you would have something you're proud of. But it was never first house is my final house. The first house was always a compromise. And very rarely was that house easy to obtain in Kirkland or in a prominent area or in Orange County or in the more expensive neighborhoods. Your first house typically was in a bad part of the town if you wanted to stay close by, because that's all you could afford. And that was normal. And it's still normal. It just, the media would make that sound horrible. And it is horrible to an extent. It would be easier if everybody's life was easy. But I don't think it's a big deal. I think that over time, as long as you're fighting, you will have enough money that this will not be an obstacle. And there are ups and downs in the housing market. And if you jump on it when the market is favorable to you, you'll do fine. I don't have to go through all of this. I'll just mention what are the other personal characteristics that make it difficult. So lack of clear goals. Next one is not understanding what it takes to move up at work. So that kind of is more pronounced with the following generations, not understanding the rules of the game. Lack of adequate education. So they have lots of education, and millennials are quite well educated, but they maybe are lacking practical education. Poor understanding of company culture. That is probably very true because company culture is not written on the wall. You have to live it to understand it. And that means social interaction is necessary. And then the last one is other. And then low self-confidence doesn't seem to be the problem because 0% of the people are reporting it. So that's good. So the next one is, which of the following would be the biggest obstacle in you taking a leadership role? So this was an interesting one. So the obstacles in taking a leadership role for millennials, this was written, it was about a year ago. First one was too much time from my other responsibilities are taken away by leadership. So in other words, I don't want to be in leadership role because I will have to sacrifice too much of my other responsibilities. The next one is stress and pressure to succeed. In other words, to be successful, it's too hard, too much pressure. I don't want it. This is an interesting generation that stated that they don't look up to successful leaders because they have to sacrifice too much. And that was shifted less towards men and more towards women. In other words, the belief, I think, of the generation is that women have to sacrifice more. The next one is too much away from my private life. Again, personal sacrifice. I value everything outside of my leadership commitment. Maybe I'm okay with putting in 8 hours of work, but I'm not ready to give more in order to succeed as a leader. And then the last one of the big ones is don't like to be in the spotlight. So in other words, I don't like the attention. So these are basically between 17 and 16% the biggest hitters of reasons why millennials don't want to take leadership functions. These are news. This is probably an unspoken or unpublished information that may have been present with the previous generations. We do not have that generational knowledge because we did not track it as much with Generation X and baby boomers. But all of these things are essentially stating that the sacrifice to become a leader are too high. And so the question that I think we can ask, whether that is because of the lack of personal ambition, whether they don't understand what does it truly take, or whether this is simply true for them and it is as it is and with it respect. All three are fine. It will be interesting to understand why. Other obstacles that this generation is reporting is fear of failure. That is not new, that is universal. Doesn't fit with my career goals. So in other words, many of them would prefer not to be leaders. They're perfectly fine with not being that, and there is nothing wrong about it. Couldn't be my true self. So the perception that as a leader, they would not be their true self, that's a belief system. And worry if it would alienate my friends or colleagues from me. In other words, would I have a social loss happen to me because of the becoming a leader? And those are very things. In other words, if you, depending on your leadership style, yes, that can happen. So these are some interesting things. Now, to put this thing, I would like to basically bring this thing towards the economic future part. So I don't have any slides for the economic future part. All of these trends that we are talking about is showing that there is a changing set of expectations and perception of success as we go from generation to generation. It may be that the formulation of success is truly changing, and it may not be as important to the future generation to be as financially successful as it was to the previous ones. I do not have necessarily much reason to believe that, at least when I look at the social media posted by the generation Alpha, Z, and Millennial. They really do appreciate expensive things in life. So it's a very materialistic belief system, I think. I don't know if I'm seeing everything, but what is obvious is what I'm seeing. So I don't know that necessarily definition of success is different, but apparently the price of success has been changed. They may not be as willing to commit themselves fully to their success and sacrifice everything else. That I think is more in alignment with the beliefs that Europeans have and some other first world countries. US is a little bit more pronounced in sacrifice everything to gain everything. This may be changing, and I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to change. It's just something we need to recognize that possibly the average success in the future will be lower than it was in the past. The economic trends that we are seeing are the trends that we need to acknowledge, and that is we have millennials that are the biggest work class group. They are even the oldest one are probably 20 years away from retiring, but they will not be able to cover all of the functions as we move forward. In other words, as we grow and as the millennials grow, they will be replacing my generation, which is Generation X, just like my generation replaced the baby boomers. That is a natural thing and fine in itself. The thing is, however, that as the generation succeeds and grows in their career, they create an opening for the entry level jobs. And this is what has been a problem for us as it is for the last 4 or 5 years. And it's probably going to continue, that we simply don't have the layer of workers willing to start from the bottom. And that is somewhat of a problem, and I don't have a good solution for it. Will AI and robotization help in those things? Probably out of necessity, yes. But I don't think that they will be quick enough for us to have solutions in time, not to need workers in the factory, not to need workers that are in warehouses, not to need people at McDonald's, not to need people who are basically doing the $20 per hour jobs. We will simply need those employees. And it's a sad thing that we look down on those positions today. I think that is a social blind spot. And as long as we look down on those positions, nobody will want them. So I think that's something we'll have to sort out as we move forward. The end of that journey is that baby boomers who are going to be retired by the let's say next 5 years, at least they will be 65 and partially or fully retired. In the next 5 years, the next one leaving are going to be the shrinking Generation X. That's going to be basically in 2030, they're going to be 64, the oldest ones. And over the next decade or decade and a half, Generation X will exit the workplace and they will be retired. The challenge for that is that the biggest generation that ever was, which is the baby boomers, is being replaced by millennials. Generation X is being replaced by millennials, and nobody's replacing millennials. So what we are basically seeing is we're seeing a shrinking workforce in the US because we're not successful at integrating people at the low-level positions. That is a big challenge that I don't know how it's going to be resolved.
Because nobody wants to do those entry level jobs. And also, if AI eats those jobs up too, there are less opportunities there.
AI will not eat all of those jobs. Somebody needs to work at McDonald's flipping burgers. even if the AI takes the ordering part out. So AI
Mhm.
can't take your order. Somebody will need to create that, will need to be on the assembly line, either at McDonald's, in the production of cars, in the production of PCs. Somebody will need to manage all of the inventory, and all of that stuff will not be quick or easy to replace. And if we replace it, keep in mind, in the hierarchy of pay, most people are at the bottom.
You're correct in the blue collar world, but for some reason, I always just come back to like engineering firms or tech firms where the entry level job is that junior level developer.
True, but they're not
Or
paid at $20 per hour, right? They're usually paid more, right? So I would say that for white collar jobs, probably it's 25 to $30 an hour. That is a startup position, right? You don't normally start them at the minimum wage because they have some years of experience and or some years of college, right? And you would basically assume that they're worth more than somebody without school.
yeah,
So wrong.
they
That
paid
is,
$250,000 for college, so they deserve $5 more an hour, I guess.
yeah, yeah. The equity of that is something to be discussed, but that is how the world turns.
Yeah,
So
we're investors here. I don't know what the ROI on that is, but anyway, continue.
So basically, it brings us to the point that the blue collar jobs, especially the entry level one, at this point are hard to fill. And the problem is that if they're hard to fill now, in 10 years, we will not have any experienced people who can do those jobs. So that is the problem. The problem is that in 2035, we will not have any experienced people who can do those jobs because we never had entry level people to learn how to do. So that's a challenge in itself that we need to see. And for the US, that may mean that our manufacturing is gone permanently. Not a good outcome to be. So what does that mean? We need to find a way to equalize that. The two ways to equalize it is to pay entry level jobs way more. The only problem is that our financial structure is not set up that way. So if we were to democratize the pay in such way that people are generally being paid more and there is a smaller difference between high level and low level positions, which is typically what is achieved in Europe due to their taxation system primarily, we would basically end up with kind of equality in pay. Whether you're the CEO or whether you're the entry level person, both of you make $60,000 and that's fine, right? Except the CEO makes 600,000, but that is taken through the taxes away from him, and the entry level person doesn't pay any taxes, right? So that is basically the model in some parts of the Europe that essentially that's how they make everybody live fine and nobody lives extraordinarily well. So that's one of the ways of dealing with it. I think United States is not likely to switch that way very quickly, if at all. And that poses a question, where are we going to be in the 2030s? The question there is, which part of the economy will be protected from these demographic changes? Which part of the economy will be a good investment area for us? How do we make sure that the areas that are strong continue to be strong? And where are the areas that we need to work towards to make sure that our investments are protected? And I think that is an interesting area to discuss. Chances are that labor intensive functions are going to be having ups and downs. So perhaps you have a point that the investment into the real estate is a safe investment because it is once and done. Those assets seems to appreciate independent of the labor situation, right? High technology, is that going to be impacted by AI? Are we going to have ups and downs? Is that going to impact the value of the companies in which we invest? That's a question for Wall Street that we need to take a look at. So far, what we are seeing is that the companies that adopt AI raise in value because they let go of a whole bunch of people and they continue to produce what they did in the past. And that's a short term that is expected. In the long term, the question is who is going to be buying the products if nobody has a job? So those are the things that would be a question 10 years from now. Who can afford a house if nobody has the money to buy it? Right? So there are some questions that we need to answer that are really TBD as far as the future goes. And I can only guess those things. Some of the things that we need to make sure that we are doing, and that is that we are doing our best to delay impact of all of these things to our business as much as possible, which means working with the younger generation, finding a way to integrate them into the society, understanding that ups and downs exist and roll with them. Know that today you'll make an extra dollar. Make sure that you have that extra dollar when the economy turns. Keep in a positive state of mind. Work with the people that are helping you get wealthy to continue to be well. continue to work with them to make sure that they see the opportunities when you see downturns. There are some things that we need to learn as a society to be a little bit more graceful about. And ultimately, what can you do? If you're smiling and you believe in yourself and you're going into the unknown, you're more likely to come out alive than if you walk in expecting doom and gloom. I would err on the side of optimism, primarily because I saw that that works. And that's how I would class my part of the presentation.
Yeah, I think a lot of people come out of this very cynical. The world is going to end, but a lot of this has happened before. History repeats itself. The world will continue. It's got to keep evolving.
And so
Understand?
absolutely. And we will find a way. We always do, always did in the past. When you take a look at the rest of the first world, US is set up way better than the rest of the first world, including Japan, US, Australia, China, if you want to include them, Russia, if you want to include them, right? Of all of those countries, US is by far in the best position to be fine. And whether we will be fine or less impacted remains to be seen. Our commitment to work, optimism, and commitment to ourselves is stronger than elsewhere. And I think we're more realistic about things and less in the state of protection, more in the state of offense. So I think this is a good place to be. And when we look at where where the shiny star is going to be picking from the clouds, it's here. Still, I still believe that. Any other comments, Lane?
No, I think thanks for the jumping on. I think it's fascinating topic material. Like you said, there's microeconomics, which is what you do with your own money and your business, macroeconomics, which we talk a lot about on this channel. But then a lot of this stuff is more generation, bigger stuff. Still ties into macroeconomics and air investments too. But yeah, thanks for jumping on. Tomas, you want to get your information out there just in case anybody's, how can you help people? And yeah, just get you, in case someone wanted to reach out.
Sure. This is not the only thing that I pay attention to. So the things that I pay attention to is helping small businesses be successful. When I say small businesses, the biggest businesses I help are about 500 million, and the smallest businesses are maybe 5 million. So anything in between. I'm actively involved with the companies in Honolulu and in Seattle, and I would not shy away from getting involved somewhere else if there was a need. But these are the areas where I have most presence. If somebody is tickled by something I have said, either positively or negatively, or want to expand the discussion, you can reach out to me. And Lane has my information. My website is t2team.com. So that's www.team.com. You can look me up there, or you can look me up on LinkedIn. My name is Tomasevic, and you can pick me up that way, and I would be gladly engaging with any of you.
Yeah. And Tomas is certified in the predictive index. So if you're looking to dig a lot deeper into the individual interactions with your key employees, key staff members, it adds another layer onto this whole demographics things, which is just generalities there. But as we to close the loop on this presentation today, we started at the top with beliefs and things you believe. I think that's why I join groups like Vistage, because you get around other CEOs, entrepreneurs, and they basically call you out on your own BS, your incorrect beliefs, people you trust.
We also learn from each other, right? So sometimes your beliefs may look wrong, but ultimately they're the thing that we need to learn. And that's the self-correcting part of peer groups, is that we get challenge each other. And sometimes we win, sometimes we learn.
Yeah. So the idea of iron sharpens iron, which is why even with our investor group, we have the family office on a mastermind group to different topic material, not less business owners, more just personal finance investing. But I think there's always an overlap between family, health, and wealth as the topics. But thanks, Thomas, for jumping on. But we'll see you guys next week.
Thank you, Larry.